Greetings to all. Welcome to Earthkeeper 2018 Stargate videos. Earthkeeper and James DeBron are pleased to present best-selling author, television documentary host, researcher and nuclear physicist, the renowned Stanton Friedman. On part 2 of his lecture on the case for extraterrestrials and UFOs. Stanton Friedman is the patriarch of ET and UFO research. The following fascinating presentation was filmed live at the Earthkeeper Arklantis event in beautiful Little Rock, heart of the verdant Ozark Mountain Valley, in the mystical crystal vortex of sacred Arkansas. The new seed donor. Part 2 of The Case for Extraterrestrials will begin immediately after this beautiful music offering. Stay tuned. All copyrights duly reserved 2018 to earthkeeper.com and James DeBron. Thank you and enjoy.
Our next speaker is someone that I have admired for many years. Stanton Friedman is a nuclear physicist, native of New Jersey who lives in Canada. He is the foremost authority on the potential of extraterrestrial life, of UFOs. He is the originator, the first man who delved into the Roswell incident. This man has an incredible intellect, an incredible ability to support his beliefs. He's well studied, he's well prepared, and he is a man that deserves our respect and our appreciation. I'd like to ask you all for a standing ovation for Stanton Friedman. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay, this is for me a new presentation. I've spoken all over the world, and I just want to let you know that the whole world is interested in flying saucers when you give them a chance to admit it. There is far more to cover about flying saucers than you can do in 2 lectures or 10 lectures. There's a huge literature out there. Some of it's garbage, some of it's good. There have been courses taught at universities about flying saucers. Not often, but and there have been PhD theses done, believe it or not. We need a lot more work. And we need the press to get off its butt to do the job that it should do. So let's see what we're going to do here. I'll repeat the conclusions that I mentioned a couple hours ago. Some UFOs are of ET origin. Remember, that's some. I am not saying all UFOs are somebody else's spacecraft. Not all isotopes are fissionable. Fortunately for us nuclear guys, some of them are. You know? Governments are hiding data. A cosmic Watergate is the phrase I like to use. I find that there are no good anti-UFO arguments. There are people who haven't studied the evidence and figure they have to take the position that there's nothing to flying saucers by grasping at straws. And none of those straws break the camel's back. I mean, it just doesn't work. And I don't know of a bigger story in terms of impact on all of society. Just imagine what would happen if tomorrow on the big news programs around the world, governments admit flying saucers are real. What would happen? I don't expect that to happen, incidentally, but it would have an impact. Okay, there's the book again. This book's been out for a few years, but I still sign all the ones I send off by mail. You can look at my website, stantonfriedman.com. Tells you how to get my books and so forth. And I don't hide, in other words. These aren't underground publications. Okay, we've gone through this. Can't get here from there. You'd be amazed at what silly arguments people make about that. You know, you'd think we were still in Columbus's time, where it took, what, 6 weeks to cross the ocean kind of thing. We're not. And again, I will reemphasize the importance of the word nuclear here. Some people get upset at me, but the world is a nuclear world. That sun up there is a fusion factory. It's not a mass of burning gas. Whether we like it or not is beside the point. Those are nuclear reactions going on there in the sun all the time, every day, and in all those billions and billions of stars out there. So there's a loss in our understanding of the world around us if we don't allow for the fact that nuclear energy is an important part of that world. How long would we last if the sun turned off? Let's turn off this darn fusion device. That's pretty silly. Okay, go through the typical hunk of hardware associated with the nuclear aircraft program. I don't think any of it's left. They might have left some of it out at the nuclear test site in Nevada. Oh, I didn't show this one before. you can see that there was a lot of effort put into what would a system really look like. And you see you have a little problem. You need to get air in. The way this works, very straightforward. You put the air through the compressors on the airplane, on the jet engines. They heat the air and they pump it through the little holes between the fuel elements so that the air really gets heated and gets kicked out the back end. But obviously, you can let the neutrons and gamma rays out if you're letting the air in. So I was working on radiation shielding, and it's a fascinating problem. How do you protect the people outside if you're going to let the radiation out through the same holes that the air comes in on? So one of the programs, incidentally, there were two big jet engine companies in the United States, General Electric and Pratt Whitney. They both had a program devoted to nuclear propulsion. GE, it was an air-cooled reactor. Pratt Whitney, a small liquid metal-cooled reactor. And you'd have another heat exchanger that takes this hot liquid metal and heats the air going by and uses that to run the jet engines. What can I say? Both programs were canceled. I understand the Russians had a program too, but I don't know what happened to it. There is a little concern. What if a nuclear-powered airplane crashes? What happens on the ground? You know, how many people are going to be hurt by the radiation because the reactor is hot, very hot, radioactive? That's an impressive-looking slide until you realize we never did build a real flight-type aircraft nuclear propulsion system. There's that ramjet. These programs took millions and millions of dollars. And I would venture that 98% of the public never heard about them. There's that again, the nuclear ramjet. I hadn't realized, these were put together and I didn't have a chance to go over them before I left. So my first thought is, oh, I didn't know we included that one there. This is the Aerojet flight type system. The reactors on the left there with the nozzle down. And I don't know whether this is what, there was a man named Ben Rich who worked for Lockheed. And he was the Skunk Works, it was called. Don't ask me where that name came from. It sounds terrible, frankly. Who would be proud of working for the Skunk Works? You know, it's a smelly program, you know. But Ben, at a talk that he gave, said we could send E.T. home. And I've never been able to determine whether he meant that we've already built a system capable of doing that, or whether we had worked out how to do it, and all we need is the approval on the budget to go ahead and do it. There are a lot of things we can do that we don't do because nobody's willing to pay for them. So, flight type, nuclear rocket propulsion system. The tank would be 35 feet in diameter, the tank of liquid hydrogen. And the thing about hydrogen, it's kind of nice. It's the most abundant element in the universe. Wherever you go, you're going to find hydrogen. So you don't need to carry all of it along. You can refuel when you get out there. The second thing is, hydrogen being the lightest element, it can go fastest when you exhaust it out the back end. And that's kind of nice if you're building a propulsion system. More bang for the buck, so to speak. That's the same system at the test site. There's this big facility out there, the nuclear test site. We've blown off a few nuclear weapons out there, and we've tested a nuclear aircraft system, a nuclear rocket system, Lord knows what else. They ain't talking much about what goes on out there. That looks impressive, doesn't it? We tested it once, That was it. Cancel the program. There's a lot of those around. Well, we think they canceled the program, and they've never admitted that they didn't. There's the nuclear rocket engine again. LASL, Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory. And, you know, as another instance of where the public really didn't appreciate what was going on. For a long time, Los Alamos employed over 6,000 people. And there were several years when it was a secret facility. People got their mail at a post office box in a small town in New Mexico. Nobody knew what was going on in Los Alamos. Turns out the Russians had a spy nearby, but we won't talk about that. But their annual budget's over $1 billion. And I mention this only because some people say, well, how could they do that without us knowing? It's easy, is my answer. You know, there are procedures to follow. Another nuclear rocket engine, the 1B. Okay. As I mentioned, Area 51 is out past this. And I wanted to bring up something that, how many of you have heard of Robert Lazar, Bob Lazar? Okay. Now, there's an interesting story. Bob did work briefly at Los Alamos. And his story was that he had a master's in physics from MIT, a master in electronic engineering from Caltech, and he worked at back engineering flying saucers. And he figured out how they work using gravity amplifiers and element 115, which sounds exotic. Uranium is 92, in case you're wondering. So ain't much element 115 around. Now, people kept asking me, and this just came up 2 weeks ago. I have said that I wanted to check on Bob Lazar. His buddy called me and said, what would it take to convince you that he was legitimate? And I said, well, copies of his diplomas. It would be one thing. A resume, a list of his papers. You know anybody who's got masters in physics from MIT that threw out his diploma? That makes no sense. I'm older than Bob by quite a bit, and I still have my diplomas. I mean, it's not something you get rid of. You know, it doesn't take up much space. Even when you move, it doesn't take up much space. And of course, I sent him an 8-page resume and copies of listings in professional organizations, American Nuclear Society, American Physical Society, American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And of course, I got nothing back. Well, the government wiped his slate clean. I asked 5 different people at MIT about him, and their legal guy said there's no way to do that. You can't get a grade point average, you know, the grades on courses without the approval of the person you're asking about. But the fact that somebody went there is on the record. Where would we be if colleges didn't have to tell the truth about such things, you know? So anyway, element 115, that sounds really exotic. And the trouble is, it was announced that there was such an element several years ago. And then Bob suddenly said, well, that's what, they had 500 pounds of it at Los Alamos. Now that sounds exciting. Well, that ought to be enough to do something useful with, 500 pounds. Well, unfortunately, the original discovery was based on operating a big accelerator for a couple of weeks and producing 4 atoms of 115. Not 4 pounds, 4 atoms, which is exotic from a physics point of view, but from a reality viewpoint, the half-life was less than 2 minutes. How do you accumulate 500 pounds of something that only exists for 2 minutes? You know, it sounds great until you say, well, wait a minute, where's the accelerator? You know? And so it is an official element 115. I've seen no evidence that anybody has 5 pounds of it, no less 500 pounds. And Bob's excuse when somebody asked him about it, well, it had to come from another planet because their isotopes are different than ours. Well, I'm sorry, everything we've learned about physics says that wherever you look and it's the same. Now, the amounts of different substances would be different, but the physics doesn't change what goes on just because you're someplace else. So anyway, I wanted to, for 25 years now, he every so often makes comments. And there's a strange part to this story. The best UFO journalist that I'm aware of is a guy named George Knapp. He works at, well, it's a television station in Las Vegas. He's won awards. He's a newsman, a journalist, a real one. And he has stood behind Bob. But when I talked to him recently, well, I don't think he has those degrees, he said. Well, if a guy lies about the degrees he has, why should I believe him about anything else? Because I really made the effort. I asked George, and he told me where Bob went to high school. And so it's on Long Island in New York. So I called his high school. And I said, I'm getting different stories about what his background is. Maybe you can help me. Well, call me back and I'll get his records. Okay, I did. Oh yes, he graduated in, first thing she says is he graduated in August, not with his class. Well, that automatically makes you a little suspicious. Usually the only reason that happens is you flunked a course or two someplace along the way. But to get into MIT, and I talked to the admissions office, you normally have to be in the top 15% of your class. And I know this because, personal touch, I was accepted at MIT out of high school. I couldn't afford to go. Tuition was $900 a year. Now it's $27,000 or something. But you normally have to be in the top 15% because all kinds of people want to go to MIT, and Caltech the same way. You see, neither one of them found any evidence of Bob's existence there. Nothing in any of the yearbooks. You know, it's a story without any backup. But some people want to believe it. He's a sharp guy. I've heard him when George was interviewing him, and I consider George Knapp the top UFO journalist. And when my book, Flying Saucers and Science, came out, I wanted to make sure that George is the one who interviewed me for Coast to Coast Radio, because he's the best of the batch as far as I'm concerned. And he asked very good questions. Sometimes interviews are a pain in the neck because the person hasn't done their homework, didn't read the book, you know, jumped to all kinds of conclusions and stuff. Not George. So it's one of those mysteries. And I almost feel bad about bringing it up, but this story's been going on for over 20 years. And, you know, what does it take? Why would you believe somebody who can't provide anything to back it up? So I've spent a lot of my time checking into stories that didn't have happy endings, so to speak, you know, without evidence. Let me reiterate something that I said before. We have an entirely different picture of what the local galactic neighborhood looks like. I know if I'd said galactic neighborhood 40 years ago, you say, what kind of a nutty thing is that to talk about? Well, today we can talk about it because there are stars and there are planets. And we didn't know about those planets way back when. We thought we were particularly lucky. We've got a bunch of planets in our solar system. But turns out they're all over the place out there. And that gives us a different perspective. And also it makes you wonder, if the aliens are coming here and checking us out, how patient will they be? If we start a nuclear war, what would they do? Would they say, the heck with it? Let them go. Or would they say, hey, this is our planet. What are we letting these idiots do anything down there for? It's a tricky question. Where do we fit in the scheme of things, in other words? Are we rejects from other planets? That's something to think about, isn't it? It's important that we change our perspective about how important we are. And I don't think many people are arguing now, as they did a few hundred years ago, that the world was created, 4,000 years ago. 4 billion is a better number. And the means for determining this is pretty good. The measurements, the radioactive decay, and all that sort of stuff. It's not a new idea, in other words. The data's been around. Well, there are those fusion reactions again. And, some people get upset at me about talking about, it's just because you're a nuclear physicist, that's why you bring up this nuclear stuff. But it's not. Whether we like it or not, the sun is a fusion factory. All the stars are fusion factories. Now, we didn't know that. We didn't even know there were neutrons. How smart we are, until 1932. We didn't know that the sun was thought to be a massive burning gas. All the astronomers said so in the early 1920s. But it's not. That's not where the energy comes from. It comes from nuclear fusion. Now, it makes you wonder how many other things about the local neighborhood do we not know besides fusion, those reactions. But it's the difference it makes that's important. In other words, fusion isn't twice as much energy per reaction as chemical processes, or 2,000 times. It's 2 million times. That changes everything. And what if somebody out there got there before we did? Plenty of room. Got 4 billion years to play with for us. So I think it's incumbent upon us to do a better job of letting the world know what's going on out there. And also raising the question, how do we look to them? We didn't used to think of that. But I think it's important that we realize, what's the world going to be like for, I got a great-grandson, for when he grows up? Are the aliens going to come and say, the heck with what you guys are doing? That sounds like a trivial question. How could they get here? Well, they can get here because they knew about fusion long before we did. I'm not saying there isn't anything else. I won't rule that out. Something else we don't know. Because progress comes from doing things differently. Anybody who tells you we know it all is due for a surprise. As a matter of fact, when we started getting into nuclear power, the idea, as far as people knew, was that, gee, there's very little uranium around. Well, it turns out there's a heck of a lot of uranium around. We hadn't looked, so we hadn't found. But once you start looking, you will find plenty of it. And that's good or bad. I mean, the bad guys have access too, just like the good guys. But to see the extent to which we will go to get it, in World War II, the Manhattan Project that I mentioned earlier, to develop nuclear weapons, what you realize you need is enriched uranium. Normal uranium only has 0.7% of uranium-235, the isotope that you want. Less than 1%. Oh, it's helpless, isn't it? We built a facility a mile long to pump a uranium gaseous form through. And because U-235 is a little bit lighter than U-238, by the time you get to the end of this mile-long facility, it's slightly enriched in uranium-235 because it goes a little faster because it's lighter. And so you take the stuff out and you put it back in again, and pretty soon you're getting in real enrichment. We wanted 90% enrichment for the bombs. We were spending 5% of all the electricity being produced in the United States during the war on enriching uranium. That's why the facility was built at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, because they had TVA there, Tennessee Valley, you know, with the dams and power. So if somebody decides you're going to do something, and yeah, it's going to cost a bit of dough, but let's go. We need it. And so that came as quite a surprise. And then to find out after the war that, hey, there's a lot of uranium around, much more than we thought there was. If you haven't looked, you're not finding. In other words, there weren't a lot of people looking for uranium during the war. In public, anyway. And I've had people complain to me about talking about bombs, but it does illustrate the difference between going chemical and going nuclear. Look at those numbers. A big bomb released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite. The public wasn't told about 15,000 tons of dynamite for the first atomic bomb. And the first fusion bomb was 10 million tons. So it takes a while to wrap our minds around the changes of our knowledge of the world in which we live. And that isn't knowledge that we can keep to ourselves. I've had people say, oh, those dumb peasant Russians, they can't do this. And my ancestors were Russian, so I resent that in the first place. But the second place is, nature doesn't do a job of keeping secrets from these guys and not these guys. These guys are good guys and these guys are bad guys. You know, Mother Nature doesn't seem to work that way. The nuclear fireball. Can you imagine what people thought when they saw pictures of these things? It's pretty scary. And there was something else stupid that was done. When we were running tests in Nevada with nuclear weapons, people used to line the soldiers up to look at the tests, not realizing they were exposing a lot of them to much more radiation than they should have been exposed to. And there were deaths as a result of that. You know, we could have done it some other way than having the guy standing out looking straight at the test. Hey, it's a great event. Yeah, it is, but there are some side effects we really don't want to subject people to. So mankind does some strange things. Now, this whole business about security, I get more people telling me, within the last 3 months, I've been told, governments can't keep secrets, Stan. With the internet, come on. Well, I beg to differ. How many of you have ever had a security clearance? Dozen hands. Anyway, would you agree that we can keep secrets? Okay. Keeping secrets is a matter of setting up regulations and making sure the penalties are sufficiently strong if you break the regulations that you won't do it again or won't do it in the first place. I mentioned that Operation Majestic 12 in my presentation earlier. This super secret thing, supposedly. And I've had people tell me, well, those guys certainly would have told their wives what they were doing. No way. I would be putting her and me at risk if I told my wife classified stuff. First of all, I've been breaking the rules that I had agreed by my signature that I wouldn't release this data. There are two things you need to release data. You need a need to know or to get it, and access. You can't, just because you have a clearance doesn't give you access. Say you have a secret clearance. Does that mean you have access to all secret information? Not at all. Because you don't have a need to know for most of it. Makes it a huge difference. And, when I started work at GE, the classified facility, guards at the door, nobody could go in without having appropriate clearance and need to know and stuff. The guards would walk around at night, check everybody's office, and if they found a classified document out, even though it was a closed area with guards at the door, you'd get a call at 11 o'clock, come in and inventory all your classified documents. That's not a call you want to get at 11 o'clock at night. And you had to inventory everything. If it happened twice, you were in very serious trouble, and for sure, 3 times you're out. So they put the fear of God in you. And once, I was giving a classified paper on radiation shielding at a conference, and unfortunately, my slides weren't ready for when the courier was going. There was a courier who was going to carry all the classified material from a half a dozen of us that were also giving papers. Okay, Stan, come on in. Read me the Riot Act. Now, we don't care about you, but we do care about this classified material. We'll make you a courier for this event. But the slides don't go in the trunk of your car when you're driving to the airport. They go with you in the car. By the time they got finished, I was so glad when I got to the other end and gave it to the security guy to get rid of that stuff, because you were at risk. And they told me, if the plane crashes, we don't care about you. We care about the classified material. I mean, I know that sounds silly, but you hear that from your legal guardians, so to speak, and you really want to get rid of that stuff. And you're certainly not going to tell your wife anything, because she has no way of knowing who's around that might want to find out what she knew and how to separate out what was classified and what wasn't classified. So the only way out of that is not to tell her anything that's classified or even close to classified. And I've had people look at me like, what, are you crazy? No, that's the way the system works, damn it. Like it or not. And I've been glad I haven't been working on classified stuff for a lot of years. And documents. There are so many documents out there. I've been to 20 archives. The Eisenhower Library, the Truman Library, a whole bunch of other presidential libraries and other places. And there's a ton of classified material out there. And yes, there were occasions when I thought this is stupid to have this classified. Anybody who studied a couple of years worth of physics knows that that's true. And the fact that you're leaving that element off this list of things is giving away a secret. Which sounds a little weird, but anybody would know that this material should be on the list. If it's not, that means they're probably using it in a classified application. So there's an awful lot of classified material. Will I say that some of it shouldn't be classified? Yes, of course I'll say that. So what? It's the stuff that should be that you're protecting, So documents like this, I've had people tell me, Stan, why don't you just scrape off the black? Well, because they don't send you the original documents. They send you a Xerox of it. Ain't nothing under the black. if they were sending out original documents, yes, but you don't get original documents. You get a copy. And it doesn't have what's underneath there, on there, in other words. Here's that NSA. And, you know, it took me years to get documents like this one from the NSA. I found out they published something that said that freedom of information is supposed to get you access to everything you see. You say, I want on the documents that they did a search and they come up with a number and, well, I want those documents. Well, you can't, they're classified. And then you go through a legal process of challenging them in court, and they decide to release documents that look like this one. What can you do about it? Not a damn thing. They are entitled to withhold classified material from public distribution to people who don't have a need to know and an appropriate clearance. That's the way it is. Like it or not, it's beside the point. This is jumbo. When they were going to test the first atomic bomb, they had spent an awful lot of money making plutonium. Major activity. What if it fizzles? What if it doesn't work? Well, let's run the first test of a bomb inside this huge, over 100-ton steel casing. And so they built it, transported it from Ohio to the nuclear test site. It's a big old monster. And they got wise at the end. They hung this nearby where the test was conducted. They didn't test the bomb inside it. And the bomb worked, incidentally. And this survived, loosely speaking. Now, here's something that EMS, electromagnetic submarine. You say, what's that all about? Well, it turns out that seawater is an electrically conducting fluid. It's a 2% salt solution. So what? Well, because it's electrically conducting, you can put together electric and magnetic fields. And there's a law of physics that when you have electric and magnetic fields at right angles to each other, they cause a force at right angles to both. And so maybe you can slip your way silently through the atmosphere or through the seawater. And I say the atmosphere because if you ionize the air, you know when the Apollo comes back from the moon, it glows around the front because it's going so fast, it heats the air, and that's an electrically conducting fluid. You can't get radio signals through it. So it turns out that with plasma physics devices, you can actually, well, it came up when something comes back from Mars. There was a study done. How are we going to slow it down? It's going very, very fast. And so you put a way of generating a strong electric and magnetic field on it. And they did a study, and it shows that the weight of that would be less than the weight of the heat shield you'd need in the absence of that. So I think when we're talking about flying saucers, we're talking about a two-stage system. One, how do you get from star A to star B? And then two, once you're in the atmosphere of a planet around star B, how do you move around in the atmosphere where you've got a gas, you've got pressure, you've got heating, you got a gravity field, you got all kinds of other problems. Well, one way is with a magneto-aerodynamic propulsion system, MAD, magneto-aerodynamic. And it turns out the Russians were doing some work too. I love one of their papers was influence of a magnetic field on flow in an electrically conducting fluid. That sounds perfectly innocent. until you looked at the electrically conducting fluid was actually seawater, 2% salt. But they didn't say that. So you got a mad system on one end, and somebody would say you got a mad system at the other end too, buddy. So this is actually an electromagnetic submarine that was built by students at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And I don't know if they have the picture of the students with it or not. Yeah. Stuart Way in the middle was the professor. And it worked. But he didn't want to pursue it for military applications. And so they didn't, we think. We don't know if somebody else did. Wasn't there a movie about, was it The Hunt for Red October? Is that what it was? Where the Russians supposedly had an electromagnetic propulsion system and stuff. Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. But I'm convinced that you can build a plasma physics propulsion system in the atmosphere, and it won't be cheap and it won't be easy, but it would work if you needed it. Maybe we're doing that. I don't know. They ain't telling me, that's for sure. But I don't have a clearance or a need to know. There's the students. This thing is real. And incidentally, the Japanese built one too. Kawasaki, I guess that's the name of the company. They had one and it worked. Anybody want a thesis project? Here's one. How does it work? And electric and magnetic fields at right angles to each other and a force at right angles to both. And there we go back to real submarines. And there are lots of real submarines out there, nuclear-powered ones. I don't know that I'd like the idea of serving on a nuclear-powered submarine and staying underwater for 6 months or something. It doesn't sound like a fun game, but we built them, tested them. There's that aircraft carrier. Incidentally, people have reported huge UFOs. I mean, 1,000 feet long. There was a Japanese Airlines flight that saw this huge thing out there. I think a mothership. Nobody sees motherships on the ground, only in the sky. The landers are small little ones. So wouldn't it be nice if we could figure out all the classified stuff that's been published about deep space propulsion using fusion systems, using electromagnetic propulsion on this end or that end? I don't know that anybody would want to build a civilian system like this. But maybe. There's that acceleration bit. And you wonder, what the heck is that? Well, that's one of our spacecraft, or satellites, that we sent up. And these use for electricity radioisotope thermoelectric generators, RTGs. Little devices you can hold in your hand. Well, they're radioactive, but you can hold in your hand anyway, size-wise. And these have been used on all our deep space probes. You know, we sent a satellite past Pluto. It's out there a very long way, and it took 9 years to get there, believe it or not. And it was powered the entire way by this radioisotope thermoelectric generator, which has some plutonium in it. It's not fissionable plutonium, it's another isotope. And it turns out there's a law of physics that says when there's a temperature difference between two places, you get a current flowing. That's the thermoelectric part of the system. So we have sent dozens of devices out. The Russians have used them on remote installations where you want a little power, because they'll last for years. No moving parts. Yeah, plutonium is not cheap, but you can do it. So it's another part of the story that here's another way to produce power that most of us think not at all about. But in difficult situations, it's kind of nice to be able to do that. And it doesn't need refueling, in other words. It goes on for years. The half-life is many years. So it's small, but it works effectively. And most people have never heard of them. There's one. No moving parts, which is kind of neat. Lots of them around. I might as well show you some pictures of UFOs. What the heck? There are some. I don't mean the unidentified females at the bottom. I mean the unidentified flying saucer at the top. This is, that's the Mormon temple down the bottom, Salt Lake City. The sequence, I stood at the exact location where the guy who shot these pictures, he was a journalist, and we'll see an enlargement of number 5. And I think that's ionized air around the system. I don't think that's any conventional propulsion system by any stretch of the imagination. This is Santa Ana, California. State police officer took the pictures. This is McMinnville, Oregon. And the University of Colorado study said this was one of the few cases where they couldn't explain this. There's a better print of this around, which I've got to replace this one with. Then there's the island of Trinidad with an E at the end of it, off the coast of Brazil. That ship was there as part of the International Geophysical Year. A bunch of photographers on the ship and stuff. And the object came from the right, sharp turn around the peak, and up and away. And the pictures were taken by an official Navy photographer, and they were released to the public by the president of Brazil. There's one. Now, I don't think the president of Brazil would release something that his people hadn't told him was genuine. Remember, we got 4 pictures here. And this is an official Brazilian Navy photographer. This wasn't some guy who came on board to take sightseeing pictures. There's my book about Majestic 12. I think we'll hear more about Majestic 12 as time goes on. I admit there's, 8 words you can read on this page? It's not fully blocked out. These are some of the books that I think you should read if you're really serious about this. Okay. I'm sure there are questions out there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll try to answer your questions. Yes. Thank you. Say that again. Is it still moving now?
Is it Mars?
That's probably an RTG, yes. They last for years.
Well, they said the energy would have run out many years ago, and it's been 14 years and it's still going.
The half-life of plutonium isotope is many years, so okay. I'm a little dubious about that. Yeah. Yes.
I was just wondering, did you ever interview Betty, I think her last name was Clayton, in Ireland? She had a lot of data, and she was keeping of the UFO sightings over Ireland for years, but she's dead now.
Well, you know, I've been to Ireland many years ago, and I did, I believe, talk to that person, but I can't think of her name. But yes.
Some of the projects that you mentioned the names themselves were classified. What was the process that you were able to declassify the name? Because the name itself, I mean, I used to work on KH-11, and the name itself was classified for many, many years.
Well, I don't think I gave the name of anything that was classified when, at this point in time, I wish, tell me one.
Hi, my name is Carissa, and I'm so glad you're a professional ufologist because I have a very serious question. What are your thoughts on the claims being made about UFOs coming from the lower levels of the astral and not necessarily from other planets?
Lower level of the what?
Of the astral plane. Like they're seeping through, like there's pockets. The veil, that they're saying that the veil is thinning, so they're not necessarily coming from other planets, but from the lower levels of the astral. And I hear that quite often. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I really don't have any reason to say that there is something to support the astral origin.
Okay.
Partly because I know that getting here from there is not the big deal that some people would make it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it sounds impossible, so therefore it must be something else. But I haven't found any basis for supporting that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Professional ufologist. That's got a nice sound to it, I guess I am.
What is your opinion on Billy Meyer and all of the information he has released?
I did a lot of looking at the Billy Meyer case years ago. A guy in Switzerland who supposedly took loads of pictures and so forth. And I couldn't find anything to support it. I was hoping I would, because it would be kind of neat with the pictures. But he was caught lying about a lot of things. And I get very suspicious when people are caught lying. You know, if that's not true and that's not true, why should I believe this? Hard-nosed guy that I am. So I'm not a fan of Billy Meyer. Gee, I haven't heard his name in a long time.
Mr. Friedman? Hi. I have two questions. One, I understand that there were 2 sites, crash sites in Roswell. And
Yes.
And how do you feel about underwater UFOs?
Okay, about the 2 sites, yes. Roswell is certainly involved. 2 sightings. One of the crash at Corona, and then the crash in the plains of San Augustine, not too far from where the current big radio telescope is, as a matter of fact. And I was the first to hear about that one, too. Barney Barnett was the engineer working for the government. And in my book, Crash at Corona, I talk about that. I believe there was indeed another sighting, completely separate from the Roswell one. Maybe a mid-air collision, because some of the witnesses to the wreckage on the ground talked about I'll call it a crack on the side, which if 2 saucers run into each other, you'd probably see the side of one, you know, putting a dent in the other one. But yes, the plains of San Augustine, Augustin. It's in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico, except that now the radio telescope is there. What was the other question? Underwater UFOs, yeah. USOs, unidentified submerged objects. Well, we have a separate category, and there are reports from the Navy in particular of something coming down into the water, trailing something, and then leaving the water. That's pretty neat, you know, if you can do that. And if these things work electromagnetically, as I think, then that wouldn't be too surprising, because seawater is an electrically conducting fluid, like it or not. So just like that EMS that I showed, electromagnetic system, the submarine, number 1. So there are reports of underwater, but the Navy is the least likely of any of the government organizations to talk about what they have learned. I've talked to Navy people, and I asked about UFO stuff. We don't have any, the Office of Naval Intelligence says we don't have anything about UFOs. How can I break through that? We can't release what we don't have. You know, it's an argument, a meaningful one, I guess. But the Navy Office of Naval Intelligence was the biggest and the earliest of the big military intelligence agency. And if there was anybody good at keeping secrets, it was those guys. So they have been a total black hole for putting out anything. And I've talked to people who had been in the Navy who talked to me about sightings that occurred while they were in the Navy, serving on submarines and other things. Things moving very rapidly underwater, stuff like that. And then leaving the water, that's the key thing. You know, how do you get something under the water that takes off? We don't know how to do that I know of, anyway. So what was the other one? Underwater? Okay. Other questions?
Do you know anything about what the Gemini and Apollo missions found on the moon?
My hearing isn't working well. What was that last phrase?
What did the Gemini and Apollo missions, what do you think they found on the moon, or do you have any opinion on that?
I don't know. I've talked to several astronauts. There's no question that they're interested in the subject, but they're also not saying much at all. I got to know one of them before he was an astronaut, and when I talked to him after he became an astronaut, I said I'd heard stories about astronauts seeing UFOs. Well, I don't think they saw anything that they weren't able to identify, but the way he said it made me believe he wasn't telling the truth. On the other hand, since I had had a clearance and he had had a clearance, we certainly didn't have access to each other's classified information. I respect security. I don't push somebody under those conditions, especially him. He was an astronaut. That's a difficult job. Somebody has to show a lot of skills. There's a heck of a competition to be an astronaut, you may have known. And he did fly in space. So he wasn't talking. I'm not surprised. Several of the astronauts have indicated interest in this subject. There's no question about that. Who was the second man to walk on the moon? Well, okay, I talked to him, and he was very cautious in what he said. Very interested, but very cautious.
I know that about 40 years ago, there was an incident that happened in Ellsbury, Missouri. There were 15 cattle found in a field that were dead, and all of their reproductive organs were taken. At that time, they thought that a cult had done this, but the unexplainable event of that day was no animal had one single drop of blood in it. So they had to attribute that to something else. I also know there's been many sightings around Silex, Missouri, and I just wondered if you had ever heard of any of these or about this.
There were stories years ago about animal mutilations, and they are still a puzzle as far as I'm concerned. I don't know what's going on. Maybe it's our own guys trying to figure out how much radiation got into the bodies of animals that were grazing at that land. I've heard stories like that. I don't know. It's as simple as I can say it. There's nothing wrong with saying you don't know. If you don't know, you don't know. It's no sense making it up. Okay, does that take us, that's your question? Okay. Thank you very much. Got a question. Got a question? Oh, okay.
Did the actual UFO crash take place in the city of Roswell?
No, the ranch where the crash occurred is in Corona, believe it or not. The same name as the spy satellite. Don't ask me if there's a connection, because I don't know if there is. It's a tiny little town. I drove through there once, and it was on the 50th anniversary of Roswell, and there was a sign on what used to be a theater. Forget about Roswell, it all happened here. Here's my book about that. Another one, this is by Jesse Marcel Jr., who was a medical doctor who also handled wreckage. Here's my crash at Corona. We have on tape, DVD, 27 first-hand witnesses, all of whom were dead except one. 70 years ago, not surprising. One book. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much. I'll be out at my table. Some of my books are still around. Thank you.
And so can we have another round of applause for Stanton Friedman?